Hello and welcome to the digestive system. With this system, it's usually a little bit more intuitive for students because you have some background knowledge going into this unit. You know about eating. And one thing to think about is that when we do eat, most of these nutrients that we eat cannot be used in the form that they are consumed in. They have to be broken down into smaller components called their monomers before the body can actually use them. So this is something that I know is taught way, way, way back in regular biology. When you consume your food is made up of four major macromolecules. And they're the four same macromolecules that make up all living things, down to a cell. Like every single cell has these four major macromolecules. Those macromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And when you consume food, you're consuming once living substances. Like even if you eat some bread or some pasta, that comes from grain, which was once living. So when your body consumes something like carbohydrates, like complex carbs, think of starch, potatoes, pasta, even celery and carrots have starch in them. Well, when your body consumes these complex molecules, it's going to break them down in a chemical reaction into its individual building blocks. And these building blocks are a lot like Legos. You can take this very simple molecule and you can build something very complex out of them. So when your body consumes carbohydrates, it's going to break down those carbs into an individual monomer or building block, which is called a monosaccharide. And the way that we say monosaccharide is glucose. So carbohydrates are broken down into individual molecules of glucose or sugar. When we eat lipids, those lipids are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. So anytime you eat butters or oils or any kind of lipid or fat in your diet, when you consume proteins like a nice cheeseburger or steak, those proteins are going to get broken down into amino acids. And then whenever you're consuming anything that was once made up of cells, there's DNA in there and RNA. So there's these nucleic acids, and those get broken down into nucleotides. And then your body takes those monomers and they build new things out of them. So once these, in order to get these molecules broken down into those monomers, it starts in the digestive system. The digestive system acts as a disassembly line that breaks down these nutrients that we consume in our food into their individual monomers that are the forms that they can be used by the body. And so once the digestive system breaks them down into these monomers, then they can get absorbed into the body and they can get absorbed into the bloodstream. Then they can get distributed to the tissues. That is a typo right here. My bad. But they can then get distributed to those tissues. Amino acids are typically immediately used in protein synthesis, while the fatty acids will get used to make new cell membranes or hormones. Um, and the digestive system is also at the same time going to eliminate anything that is not absorbed. So it will eliminate the waste, often referred to as residue. When we're studying the gastrointestinal tract or the digestive tract, that is called gastroenterology, and that's going to include any kind of diagnosis or treatment of disorders within the digestive tract. So the digestive system functions to take food in, and the taking in of food we refer to as ingestion. So I think of food goes inside of the body, or we're intaking that food, so ingestion. Then we have to move that food throughout the body, and it's going to go from one end to the other. So it will go from the mouth to the anus. And if you think about the digestive system and the gastrointestinal tract, it really is just one long tube from the mouth all the way down through these convoluted tubes and out the other end. And so nothing really enters into the body until it passes through a layer of epithelial tissue and enters into the blood. But the food will continue to move through this tube in a continuous fashion. So when food moves through the gastrointestinal tract, that is called propulsion. And then we have to break down the food, which is the digestion portion, and we're going to take in those nutrients. So we have to actually absorb those individual monomers that our food has been broken down into, and it will pass through that layer of epithelial tissue and get into the blood so it can be distributed to those tissues. And then we have the elimination of that residue or waste, whatever is not absorbed into the bloodstream. We got to get it out. And so that is usually referred to as defecation, even though sometimes you will see it referred to as egestion. Commonly, though, that is honestly more with animals than it is with humans. We usually use defecation for humans. Those 4 functions listed before will occur in 5 different stages. So the 5 stages of digestion is the first, ingestion, which is the selective intake of food, right? We get to decide what we are going to consume. Number 2 is digestion. And so we have 2 forms of ways that we can break down food into the usable form in the body. And that is mechanical, another typo, oops, and chemical. So we can have a mechanical breakdown of food and a chemical breakdown of food to get the food we consume into those individual building blocks. Then those building blocks need to be absorbed. So the third is absorption, where we have the uptake of those nutrients and building blocks through the epithelial tissue of the digestive tract, and then it will diffuse into the blood and into the lymph. Then anything that is not being used is going to be compacted into feces. So water will be absorbed, and anything that is indigestible will start being kind of packaged up. So just to backtrack for a second, absorption, this is going to take place within the small intestines, while the digestion, the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food, that's going to start in the mouth and it's going to finish in the stomach. And then compaction, where we're absorbing the water and we're consolidating everything, that is going to occur in the large intestines. And so we're going to talk about a lot of different contractions that are going to happen as food moves through the digestive system. And within the large intestines, there are what's called haustral contractions, which are those little pockets within the large intestines that contract. And then there are segmentation contractions, and this is different than peristalsis. With the segmentation, it's going to be what actually segments and forms the feces. And so the haustral contractions and the segmentation, that's part of compaction. And then we have the elimination of feces, which is the 5th stage, and that is the defecation process. The 2 types of digestion are mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. With mechanical, think of mechanics. It's physical. So it's a physical breakdown of food into smaller particles. And we're going to do this starting in the mouth. And so when we bite and rip into our food, we are cutting and we're grinding that food mechanically using our teeth. And then the food is going to get mixed and form a bolus, and that's going to go down the esophagus and it will go into the stomach. And in the stomach, you're going to have contractions of 3 different layers of muscle. The most superficial layer of muscle is the longitudinal layer. In this layer, the muscle fibers are going the long way of the stomach. And at the same time, you have the circularis muscles that go around the width of the stomach contracting. And then you also have this oblique muscularis layer, which has their muscle fibers going in the diagonal direction. That's also contracting all at the same time. And that churning action of the stomach is going to break the food down into the smaller particles. This is also going to expose the food surface to more of the digestive enzymes like pepsin and hydrochloric acid, and other enzymes that are going to help break down the food. And this churning action also occurs in the small intestines as well. So as mentioned, we have 2 different types of digestion. We have the mechanical and now we have the chemical. So with chemical digestion, this is going to occur in many different portions of the digestive tract, and it's going to include our accessory organs. So these are the organs that food doesn't pass through, but they aid in the digestion of the food. So once food passes through the esophagus, that's here, it's going to go into the stomach. And this is the first site of chemical, the second site, first site's in the mouth, of chemical digestion. And so here we're going to have hydrochloric acid as well as pepsin that's going to start to break down food. And then we're going to have this structure here, this leaf-like organ. This is actually more anatomically, it's posterior to the stomach, but I do like this image because it does show you this organ, which is the pancreas. And the pancreas, we learned a lot about in the endocrine system with its function of producing insulin. But it also has a digestive function. These cells in the pancreas, they secrete sodium bicarbonate, which will help neutralize the chyme that gets released from the stomach that is acidic. So the sodium bicarbonate is basic, and that helps neutralize that chyme that comes into the duodenum of the small intestines. Because if that didn't happen, the acidic chyme would burn a hole right on through that. So that's pretty important. But when we're talking about these chemical digestion processes, it's a series of hydrolysis chemical reactions that break down the macromolecules, so those carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, into their monomers. Carbs will get broken down into monosaccharides, also known as glucose. Lipids will get broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. Proteins will get broken down into amino acids, and nucleic acids will get broken down into nucleotides. And so those are going to be carried out by these digestive enzymes. It's going to start in the mouth where we have amylase that's actually produced by the salivary glands. And then we have the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin that's going to be released in the stomach. Then we have the pancreas that's also going to secrete some digestive enzymes. And then in the beginning of that small intestines, we're going to continue to have some enzymes involved there. Some nutrients, when we do digest them, they are present in usable form, like vitamins. If there is an amino acid, maybe you worked out and you had a protein shake and you got some amino acids in that protein shake instead of a protein like a steak, you can immediately absorb those amino acids. Cholesterol, that is a lipid-based molecule that can go right on through the membrane and you can absorb that, as well as water. We're talking about the digestive system, we can actually divide the digestive system. So we can talk about the part where the food physically passes through, and that is the gastrointestinal tract, very often referred to as the alimentary canal. So that's going to start at the beginning with your mouth. And then if you follow the passage, the food will go past the pharynx, and the pharynx gets subdivided into different areas. And then you will swallow. The epiglottis will close off the larynx, hopefully, otherwise you choke. And the food will go down the muscular layer that's posterior down through the esophagus, and it will land into the stomach. Food will get churned in the stomach and it will pass through the intestines and then the large intestines and out through the anus. Well, some things are going to help the food get digested. So in the mouth, we have our salivary glands, we have our teeth, we have our tongue. Those are going to help us digest our food. We also have our liver. Our liver actually makes bile. The gallbladder will store the bile that the liver has made. And that's a real big common misconception that students have. They think that the gallbladder makes the bile. It doesn't. The gallbladder stores the bile that the liver makes. So even if you have your gallbladder removed, you will still make bile, but it's going to be it's going to not be able to be stored. So if you eat a really fatty food, you're going to have a harder time digesting it because you're not going to have bile stored to help break down that fat in your food. You're going to just get whatever your liver is making. And then we have our pancreas, which releases sodium bicarbonate and other enzymes into the duodenum of the small intestines. If you are in class with me, I have you put these in order, but if we look at the order of the gastrointestinal cavity, if we start with the mouth, in the mouth, we're going to have those salivary glands and we're going to have our tongue. And then we're going to have the pharynx. When it comes to the pharynx, I want you to think about it as like the back of the throat. And the pharynx is going to have three parts. There's going to be the parts that's by the nose, that's referred to as the nasopharynx. The part that is by the mouth, that's referred to as the oropharynx. And then the part that's by the trachea or the larynx, which is called the larynopharynx. And then you have the esophagus, which is going to be posterior to the trachea. And then we've got the stomach, which is the satchel-shaped organ here. We've got our small intestines, which is this convoluted tube, which is very, very, very long. And then we have our large intestines. And so we have the large intestines, it's just wider in diameter than the small intestines, which is why it gets its name. I also do want to note we have this area here where the small intestines meet, the large intestines called the cecum, and then we've got that appendix right there too. But as food moves through, it's going to go through the different portions of the large intestines, which do have different portion names, just like the small intestines does. And then it's going to go through the rectum and out the anus. If we look at the digestive tract, which is also known as the alimentary canal, it really is just one continuous 30-foot long muscular tube that extends from the mouth to the anus. And it's going to include that mouth and the pharynx. The portion of the pharynx that is closest to the nose, so this region here, that is the nasal pharynx. And then you have the portion that is alongside the mouth, and that's referred to as the oropharynx. And then you have this portion here that is by the larynx, and that is going to be referred to as the larynopharynx. And then we have the esophagus, which is going to be posterior to the trachea. And the gastrointestinal tract is going to be the stomach and the small intestines. So a lot of times we start to refer to as like gut, and when we talk to gut bacteria, or we refer to gut, that's going to refer to the small intestines and the large intestines. Looking at the alimentary canal, that I love this image because it really does show that it is just one long 30-foot tube starting in the mouth and extending all the way through to the end. And nothing really enters into the body until it passes through a layer of epithelial tissue somewhere along this alimentary canal. So when we're looking at this alimentary canal, all areas of it will have 4 layers of tissues. And if we look at this area right here, this is called the lumen. So this is where the food is passing through. It's like the free space if we didn't have any food in our bellies. But if you got food in your belly, well, this is the area the food is passing through. And so the area that's actually touching the food is called the mucosa layer. And that includes this thin layer of epithelial tissue, which is going to be a simple columnar epithelium. And embedded in this simple columnar epithelium is going to be goblet cells. And if you guys recall back from 201, way back in the tissues unit, and we talked about it a couple times previously, in the respiratory system, those goblet cells love to make mucus. Mucus, mucus, mucus. They are mucus secreting machines. And so that's why this has the name of the mucosa layer. And then it's also going to include this deeper layer here called the lamina propria, where you'll find the ducts from glands. And then it will include this little layer, this very thin layer of muscle, which is the muscularis mucosa layer. And that layer can contract to help move the food through and help release some of that mucus. Deep to that layer, we're going to find the submucosa layer. So this is going to be the layer that has the glands, right? And then the duct's going to go through the mucosa layer into the lumen. And then we're also in this layer going to find, it's a busy layer. We're going to find blood vessels, arteries, and veins, and we're going to find nerves. So later in this lesson, I'm going to talk about these plexuses. So the plexus of Meissner, also known as the submucosal plexus, and we're also going to talk about the myenteric plexus here. So it's a very, very busy layer. And then there is the muscularis layer, which is usually referred to as the muscularis externa. Sometimes I forget to say externa, and I just say muscularis layer. So the muscularis layer is the muscularis externa, but don't confuse it with this one over here, the mucosa. So this is the muscularis externa because it's more external. And there are 2 layers. There is the circular layer that goes around the width of the alimentary canal, and then there's a longitudinal layer that goes the length. And those are going to have really important roles in how food is moved. And then we're going to have the 4th layer, which is the outermost covering, called the serosa. And this is going to be a layer of epithelial tissue, and it's also going to have some areolar connective tissue, which we'll talk about in some slides coming up. Here is a slide we're going to see many, 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 many times, but it is a good slide. So if we orientate ourselves here, we have the diaphragm. So this is the esophagus, as if we were to take like a cross section and like cut the esophagus right cut the tube right underneath the diaphragm. And so when we're looking at this, you can see this inner lumen, which is where the food is going to pass through. And then we can see the mucosa layer here, and we can see that we have this epithelial tissue. Depending where in the alimentary canal we're looking at, that will determine the type of tissue it is. In the mouth, it is a stratified squamous epithelium. In the esophagus, it's going to continue that stratified squamous epithelium for protection. But in the small intestines, we're going to have a simple columnar epithelium. Same thing with the large intestines. And then we're going to see the outer layer where we've got the submucosa layer. And then we have the layer out of that. We have the muscularis externa layer. We have the longitudinal and the circularis muscles. And then we have this outermost layer here, this little thin guy, which you can see this connective tissue is kind of getting peeled off there in the picture. That is the serosa. So going from superficial to deep, because that's how my brain works, we have the serosa. And the serosa is also known as the visceral peritoneum, which we're going to talk more about coming up. This membrane, it secretes a slippery, watery fluid, and that's going to help us reduce friction as the organs contract and the food moves through the digestive system. Then we're going to have the muscularis externa, and this layer of muscle will extend in two directions. We have the circular layer that's going to go around the alimentary canal, and then longitudinal layer that's going to go the long ways, and we'll talk about why that's important for moving food. Then we have the submucosa, which is going to have all the glands, the nerves, and the blood vessels. It's that busy layer. And then we have the most deep layer that's going to come into contact with the food. That will be a different type of epithelial tissue based on where we're at in the digestive system. In the mouth, it'll be that stratified squamous epithelium, where in the intestines, it'll be the simple columnar. And the functions of this mucosa layer is to secrete some digestive enzymes, mucus. There's a lot of hormones that are produced. We have what's called the enteric nervous system, and these tissues communicate with each other to let them know what kind of food is coming through so we can absorb all those nutrients and make sure everything's broken down. And it also has some lymphatic tissue to help protect from pathogens, so that way they don't even get into the body. So looking at this picture here, some histology, we have the esophagus. And so looking at this innermost portion, this is the lumen. So it's as if there was a cross section taken and we are looking like down the tube. It's just squished. And then if we look at this layer here, we have the mucosa layer. So because this is the esophagus, we can see that this is a simple squamous epithelium. And so I can tell that because this darker purple actually represents the basement membrane, and there is many layers of these squished like cells. And then what I have deep to the mucosa layer is the submucosa. So then I've got the muscularis externa layer. So the submucosa will have those glands. It's the busy area where I'm going to find my blood vessels. And then the muscularis layer, I've got my circular muscles. So this is actually the muscle that's going around the tube. So when it contracts, it will make the diameter get smaller. And then you have the longitudinal muscle on the external portion, and that will propel food down the tube. At this image, it's a histology image of the intestines. And so there's my laser. Here we have the lumen. And so this layer here, we have the mucosa. And where you see these little finger-like projections, those are called villi, but we'll talk more about those later. And then you got this layer here where we have the submucosa. So there I have like a blood vessel, and we're going to also find those nerves in this area here. And then we have the muscularis layer, and we've got the two layers. And then this layer right here would be the serosa. So if we start at the very deep innermost part of the alimentary canal, we are looking at the mucosa. And this is the mucous membrane that lines the lumen. So the innermost layer is going to be a layer of epithelial tissue in most of the digestive tract. So the small and the large intestines, this is going to be a simple columnar epithelium. As I mentioned, like in the esophagus, it's a simple squamous. But what I do want you to know is for the digestive tract, it's a simple columnar, which means it will have those goblet cells embedded in them. And then in the mouth or the esophagus, and then in the lower portion, so in the beginning and in the end, we're going to have that stratified squamous, which if we recall the function of stratified squamous, it is for protection. So those areas need some extra protection, while in the digestive tract, like the intestines, we're looking at absorption, so we're going to have the simple columnar. And then we're going to have this lamina propria layer, which is going to be a layer of loose connective tissue. And then we're going to have a very thin layer of some smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle, remember, we don't control or how fast we can contract smooth muscle. It's involuntary. And so when it tenses, it will tense the mucosa that creates these grooves and ridges that can actually enhance contact with food, increasing surface area, connecting with food, therefore increasing areas for nutrient absorption. And that will improve the efficiency of digestion, so exposing that food to digestive enzymes and increasing nutrient absorption. And in this mucosa layer, we're also going to have our malt that we've already talked about, the mucosa associated lymphatic tissue that has a whole bunch of lymphocytes and lymphatic nodules. And so one thing I do want to note before I go to my next slide is don't mix up this muscularis mucosa with the muscularis externa. That's going to be a more superficial layer. It's going to be further away from the lumen. So here's that image again. And so here, once again, I have my lumen. And what I'm talking about with the mucosa layer is this layer here. Right, so I have this stratified squamous epithelium because I'm in the esophagus. If I was in the small intestines, it would be a simple columnar epithelium. And then this area here, the lamina propria, right, that layer right there. And then that is going to be the layer that has the malt. And you can see this little pinky layer. That's going to be that really thin layer of muscularis mucosa. Here it is under histology, and I'll have an activity for you guys to look at the stuff underneath the microscope. So if we're looking at these mucosa layers, here I'm in the esophagus again, so I've got that stratified squamous epithelium, which is here. You can actually see some desquamation right there. And so that's where you see the dark purple. And each one of these little tiny purple dots is actually the nucleus of each cell. And then where you see that really kind of dark, dense purple line, that is called the basement membrane. And then we've got some connective tissue. So the connective tissue layer is called the lamina propria, which is going to have those blood vessels there and nerves. And then we have the muscularis mucosa layer here. When we get into the submucosa, that is the area that contains all of these blood vessels. Like I keep saying, it's the busy layer. So there's these bunch of nerves. When we have a whole bunch of nerves, we call them plexuses. And in some places, we're going to have mucus secreting glands that are going to secrete lubricating mucus, and it's going to pass through that mucosa layer into the lumen. And sometimes we also see that molt extends into the submucosa layer in some parts of the GI tract. And so in this image here, the submucosa layer is that gray layer right here. And we can see all of those blood vessels. I like this image here because we see all of those glands and lymphatic vessels and the nerves within that submucosal layer. Here's that histology again. So I am once again looking at the esophagus. I have that stratified squamous epithelium. So here I've got the lumen, which is the innermost part. And so the mucosa layer includes that epithelium. There's my basement membrane, my lamina propria, and that muscularis mucosa. The submucosal layer is here. This is that busy layer where I'm going to find all of those blood vessels, and I'm going to find all of those nerve plexuses. If I zoom in to that submucosal layer, we'll see that it's very, very cellular. And there are blood vessels and nerves. So here I have a nerve cell body. That's actually the nucleus. And then I've got lots and lots of different types of cells here. And then down here, I can see the smooth muscle of the externa. When we look at that muscularis externa layer, it's going to consist of two layers of muscle that are near the outer surface of the alimentary canal. And they're going to alternate in their squeezing. So the innermost layer, that is the circular layer. And in some places, this layer is thickened and it will form valves. So for example, at the end of your esophagus, before food can get into your stomach, there is a valve. And so that valve is a thickened inner circular layer, and it forms a sphincter, which is a circular, smooth muscle that can regulate the passage of materials through the tract. And then the outer layer is going to be responsible to help propel the food through the tract. And that's the longitudinal layer. So it goes a long way of the muscle, and when it contracts, it shortens and it kind of shoots the food through that alimentary canal. So if we look in this image again, we look at that muscularis externa layer, we can see these fibers. And if you notice, they're going in two different directions. We have the circularis layer, that is the innermost layer going in this direction, and then the longitudinal layer. Here we have the histology images of those layers. And we have the outer layer, that's the longitudinal, and the inner circular. So this is really good to show you like the contrast of the direction of the fibers. When we get to the outermost layer, that is called the serosa. And the serosa is a thin layer of connective tissue, specifically areolar connective tissue. And so areolar connective tissue, I know it was a long time since you took 201, but this tissue has a lot of ground substance in it. It has a lot of space. It's airy. And then it has different fibers in it. It has collagen fibers and it has these elastic fibers. And this areolar connective tissue is going to be topped with a simple squamous mesothelium. Not trying to throw a new term at you. Mesothelium is a specialized type of epithelium. So it's epithelial tissue that specifically lines body cavities like the pleura or the GI tract. We just have to make it confusing and now call it a mesothelium. But you already learned all about it. So this is a very, very thin layer. And this is the outermost layer that you can actually physically touch. And it starts to begin in the lower, like 3 to 4 centimeters of the esophagus, and it ends just before the rectum. Sometimes it can be labeled as adventitia. Back when I was learning about this stuff, they used adventitia a lot more than serosa, but we're using serosa a lot more. So just like in the cardiovascular system, when we said the outer layer of the heart wall is the same thing as the visceral pericardium, we're going to have the same thing here. The serosa is the same layer as the visceral peritoneum. And if we look at the histology of the serosa layers, we can see the mesothelium here. And then this area here is the muscle layer. And then the serosa layer that we're focusing on is right here. So it's a layer of that connective tissue. And if we look at this image once again, I want you to take notice how the fibers in that layer, like just look at that thin layer there. And in this image, the layer, the serosa, is actually labeled as the visceral peritoneum here. So that is the same layer. So when it comes to the nervous system, we have some neural control. When you think of the word enteric, entero means intestines. So the enteric nervous system is this nervous network within the gastrointestinal tract. So it includes the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and it regulates the digestive tract, the mobility of the tract, including the contractions, how active the glands are to secrete their substances. It's controlling blood flow to the gastrointestinal tract. It is thought that we have over 100 million neurons involved in the enteric nervous system, and these nerves talk to one another. So nerves, they don't just send signals to the central nervous system. They can function independently of the central nervous system, and they can communicate within each other. That's why I always say to trust your gut. But the central nervous system can usually exert an influence on its action. And the enteric nervous system is considered to be part of the autonomic nervous system. So this enteric nervous system has two different networks, and we're working on getting rid of the person names. So we're looking at submucosal plexus, which is once known as Meissner plexus, and the myenteric, which is formerly known as the Arbach plexus. So the submucosal layer, like I said, this is a very, very busy layer. Anything like glands, blood vessels, and movement of the muscularis mucosa layer is going to be under control of the submucosal plexus, right? That should make sense. Anything in the submucosal layer is going to be under neural control of the submucosal plexus, while the myenteric is going to be in the muscularis externa layer. So don't get this confused. The submucosal plexus will control movements of the muscularis mucosa, right? Because that's that little tiny thin layer in the submucosal layer. But more external than that, we have the muscularis externa, and that is going to be under control of the myenteric plexus. So this is under the parasympathetic nervous system. And that plexus is going to be found between the layers of muscle within the inner circular and the outer longitudinal muscularis layers. This will control movement of food through the intestines and the stomach, which we call peristalsis. And we'll talk more about what a peristalsis contraction is. Here we have the myenteric, which you can see between the two layers of a muscle. You have the outer longitudinal muscle here. There we go. And then you have the inner circular muscle here, and this right there, that is that myenteric. Note that it says the name, but we're going away from that. If we look close up, we'll actually see that in this plexus, these are neuron cell bodies, which are different than these muscle cells here. And that nerve cell body labeled in the submucosal layer, this is actually the submucosal nerve plexus, right? So we see submucosal connective tissue here, and then there I've got the nerve body. So that tells you I'm in the submucosal nerve. When it comes to the peritoneum and the mesenteries, these are connective tissue sheets that help hold the stomach and the intestines from the abdominal wall, and they help keep things in place. They're kind of loose, which will allow the stomach and intestines to undergo their contractions and give them freedom of movement within the abdominal cavity. However, it's going to hold them relatively in place to one another. The peritoneum is a serous membrane, meaning it has two layers. A serous membrane is that simple squamous epithelium, and so it's going to allow movement. And a mesentery is going to be two layers of a peritoneum. When we look at the structures, they will help prevent the intestines from becoming twisted just by moving and by their own body contractions. Not body contractions, sorry, just by their own contractions. And they provide passage of blood vessels. Oh, sorry, another typo. Blood vessels and nerves that supply the digestive tract. They're going to contain lymph nodes and many lymphatic vessels as well. So like other serosal membranes, we will have a visceral serosa or layer, and we'll have a parietal layer. The visceral is on the organ itself, and the parietal will line the body cavity. Not only does the parietal peritoneum hug and line the cavity wall, but it also turns inwards towards the posterior midline and it forms what's called the dorsal mesentery. It's a serosa. It has two layers of a membrane that will hang down and it will extend into the digestive tract. These two layers are going to separate and then they will pass on along opposite sides of the organ, forming the visceral peritoneum on the organ itself. Then they're going to come together on the far side of the organ and continue again as another sheet of tissue on the anterior or front portion of the organ. And so then, because now we're on the front, it's going to be called the ventral mesentery. This is showing the mesentery coming off and forming the serosa layer of the visceral peritoneum, going around the organ. Then it's going to continue to go around and to the other side of the organ. If we look at this diagram here, we can look at the yellow and we can look over here near the spine. And I want you to take note of these mesenteries and look and see how they wrap around the organs, forming the visceral peritoneum. The dorsal mesentery, if we look at that, it extends into the digestive tract and it goes around the loops of the intestines. It goes around the stomach. It goes around these organs and then it comes together again and it gets to the front of the organ, forming that ventral portion. The omentums, these structures will be anteriorly viewed. So these hang down in the front. So look at how there is a piece between the liver and the stomach. This right here, this portion here, so that is the lesser omentum. The greater omentum is going to hang off the front. And it's going to hang off from the front of the stomach. So when you first cut into the abdominal cavity, this is actually what you're going to see first is that greater omentum. And it contains fat. It's going to cover the small intestines like an apron. And that fat will insulate, cushion, and help protect those abdominal organs. There's also going to be some lymph nodes that contain macrophages. If we look at this image here, we can note the lesser omentum between the liver and the stomach here. And then we can see extensions of the anterior mesentery. That is the omentum that is hanging down and covering everything. Here, the omentum is in a cadaver. You can see the lesser omentum here. This is the liver and the stomach. And then we can see the greater omentum covering everything like an apron. Here is a dissection image. We can see the liver, that is this brown structure here, and then this is the stomach. This little bit of fat right here between the liver and stomach is the lesser omentum, and then this is actually like quite a bit. This is like more than it should be, but this is a lot of the greater omentum. And then looking at this, we're looking at mesentery. So these are going in between all of the intestines and connecting them together and keeping them in position. And that's going to be connected posteriorly. If we look at this diagram here, we can look at the visceral peritoneum in all of the organs and the parietal peritoneum that lines the body cavities. So, right, so here we got the visceral and then I've got the parietal. And you can definitely see the body cavity here. We have the peritoneal cavity, all of the space. Well, I want you to notice the lesser omentum and the greater omentum. So here we have the lesser omentum here between the liver and the stomach. And then we have the greater omentum here between the stomach and hanging down in the front like an apron. Then note how the mesentery is also connected to all of the parts right here in the back and covers all of the parts of the intestines. Also, near the colon, we have a structure of the mesentery that will anchor the colon to the abdominal wall called the mesocolon. If we are looking at this cavity and something is within the cavity and it has the mesentery on all sides, it is called intraperitoneal. But if something is in that cavity and it lies against the posterior part of the body wall and it's only covered by a peritoneum on its anterior side, it is said to be retroperitoneal. So organs that are intraperitoneal are like the stomach, the liver, and parts of the large and small intestines, while retroperitoneal organs will be the duodenum of the small intestines, pancreas, parts of the large intestines, and then when we get into the urinary system, we'll learn that the kidneys are as well. So the greater omentum, if we look over here on the right side of the diagram, we can see that the greater omentum has been kind of lifted up. And you can note the mesocolon here. And you can see that the mesentery, that mesentery is going to all of the loops of those small intestines. And within this structure, I just want you to take note of all of those blood vessels that are in that mesentery, along with those lymphatics. So going forward, I'm going to break everything down by portions. So what is up next is the mouth, and then we'll talk about the stomach, and then the small intestines, large intestines, and we'll break everything down into individual parts.